Ethan Nadelmann, sitting next to me, is our esteemed international visitor this year at MardiGrass. Ethan has been involved if you define involved as at the forefront and central to drug law reform in the United States and internationally for 30-something years, I don't know, more than that. The Drug Policy Alliance was a New York-based organisation that Ethan led for many, many years, until 2017, I think he stepped away officially from that, but at the forefront of every significant campaign in the United States around drug law reform, the initiatives in California around medicinal cannabis in 1996. My microphone work is not good today, sorry, Stu. And beyond, the various initiatives that have led to the United States being a patchwork of liberal freedom and not so liberal places in other ways, and internationally as well. So we're very, very pleased to see Ethan, or to have Ethan visiting us today. Today we're speaking more about other subsects, so not cannabis and psychedelics and psilocybin and other substances, and where we might be up to on that. So if you were here yesterday, good for you, but we're speaking about some slightly different material, no doubt some overlap, but nonetheless, thank you again, Ethan, and over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So, yeah, yesterday I focused, how many of you were here for my talk about cannabis yesterday? Just raise your hand. So some of you are not. I've been involved in this area since 1982, 83. And I got going initially when I was writing a PhD dissertation on the internationalization of crime and law enforcement. And I actually talked my way into the US State Department's Narcotics Bureau. I got a security clearance. I would hang out every night going through the secret and top secret files and realizing there wasn't all that interesting that was not in the newspapers. And then went all around Latin America, Europe, 19 countries, interviewing drug enforcement agents and customs agents and intelligence agents and others, and wrote a book called Cops Across Borders about that, which actually the guys in the DEA quite liked. I really leaned over backwards to find out how they dealt with crime when it became internationalized. But all the time I was doing this, I fundamentally knew the war on drugs was misguided. And initially it hit me, as somebody who had gone to college when I was 18 and started smoking cannabis and enjoyed it and wondering why this was illegal. And as I got a little older, I started doing psychedelics, mushrooms in particular, and I thought those were spectacular. And I could see why maybe they shouldn't be sold over the counter, but still, they're not addictive. And the problem with them is if you use them in the wrong situation or the wrong place, where you're not with friends and you're not practicing smart harm reduction approaches. I also, but those were good. Now, what I was struggling with was heroin. And was scared of heroin. And then I started reading about heroin. And there was a fellow named Arnold Treback, an American professor, who wrote a book called The Heroin Solution, a Stanford law professor, John Kaplan, who wrote about heroin. There were people in the UK, Jerry Stimson, writing about heroin. And I started learning about heroin and also about why British doctors had been prescribing pharmaceutical heroin, since early in the 20th century. And they were mostly prescribing it to people who had become addicted to opioids through their doctors, iatrogenic addiction it's called. But they were oftentimes relatively middle-class people who got, because of pain and opioids, whatever, got caught up. And I said, how could this make sense? I mean, heroin's the demon drug, the one that people are, committing crimes and dying and all this sort of stuff. But it turned out, I don't know how many of you know this, heroin's scientific name is diamorphine. Heroin, when you put it into the human body, becomes morphine. It just feels different going in. Heroin can be taken orally or smoked or injected or what have you. It turns out that pharmaceutical heroin, that if you taking it on a daily basis without monkeying around the dose from a legal, secure supply, you can live to be 90 or 100 years old. It doesn't destroy the bodily organs. Alcohol can destroy your liver, cigarettes can destroy all sorts of things, cocaine or stimulants can destroy your heart if you do too much of it. But opioids, if it's a stable dose, you know, you ask a doctor, if I start taking morphine or for that matter heroin every single day, pharmaceutical supply, steady dose, what's the worst that's going to happen to me? And I'll look at you and I'll go, well, you know, what you really got to watch out for is the constipation. And that's the major problem with it. And you might develop less sensitivity to physical and emotional type of pain, right? But that was mind-blowing to me, that there were people in the UK who had been on this for decades and were holding legal jobs and having families and driving, and it just wasn't an issue. Now, that began to transform my understanding. It began to get me to realize that, you know, the issue here was not the drug, it was the fact that when you're getting it illegally, you're getting it of unknown potency, unknown purity from the illicit market. You're paying black market prices, which, I mean, heroin doesn't cost that much to produce legally. It's the black market price which increases the price so much. You're having to interact with criminals. You're having to obtain syringes. Oftentimes, in my country at least, many states made it impossible to obtain a syringe in a pharmacy without a prescription. So you're using oftentimes sharing syringes and all this sort of thing. So I began to realize it was prohibition that was fundamentally the problem. And though I would not recommend to anybody that they start using opioids on a daily basis or heroin, I began to realize it wasn't that huge a deal. And so that began to get me to think more broadly than just cannabis about drug policy reform. And then at that time, you know, in the late 80s, apart from the United Kingdom, where they were already pulling back on doctors prescribing, what had happened actually was heroin started coming in from, you know, Southwest Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and you had a whole kind of junkie crowd that were beginning to do that stuff, and it began giving heroin a bad name. And then you had all these people coming not from middle-class iatrogenic addiction, but coming from the streets, you know, flooding the doctors' offices, and these doctors who've been perfectly happy maintaining a small number of middle-class patients on pharmaceutical heroin, and sometimes even heroin and cocaine, like a legal speedball prescribed, you know, did not like dealing with this other group of quote-unquote, if I use the word junkies, I'm using it in an affectionate kind of way, shall I say, so please excuse my use of that term. And so but you still had some doctors who were doing it, and they did not make it illegal, and the British system was fundamentally one that said a doctor is allowed to prescribe any pharmaceutical substance, right, in the pharmacopoeia. They did not have something like we had in the US, which maybe you have here too, Schedule I, you know, the prohibited drugs, the drugs that no doctor can prescribe and that can only be used for research purposes if you're willing to jump through a zillion hoops and lock it up in some kind of crazy safe and all this kind of stuff. So that really began to open up my mind more broadly to what was going on and to the possibilities. And in fact, you know, you saw, in fact, remarkably, beginning in Australia, you know, and Alex Wodak, you know, in the late 80s. I'm sometimes referred to as the Alex Wodak of the United States. Just so you understand, we are, you know, not just cannabis reformers, but broad-based drug law reformers. We take, you know, anywhere where we see the war on drugs fucking up public policy, fucking up basic values, that's something we care about. The drug policy reform agenda is defined by where the war on drugs mentality and laws are screwing something up. Right? And so he had proposed this, and then I remember in the early 90s meeting a researcher named Gabriel Bammer, and she was publishing one paper after another in top scientific journals, and it looked like Australia was on the verge of becoming the first country in the world to actually be prescribing pharmaceutical heroin to people who had become addicted to street heroin and for whom methadone maintenance just wasn't working. Methadone maintenance really is the gold standard. It's the best way to put a street heroin addiction behind you. You know, if you don't have most people tolerated it quite well, and it became the way to really stabilize your life. But doesn't work for everybody. Some people just needed that feeling of the pharmaceutical heroin. As they said, I need heroin. You know, the way some junkies refer to it is their lady love. You know, they just do not want to live without it. One way or another, they want to have that thing in their life. What I also began to appreciate was that much of what people got addicted to, I mean, heroin, like nicotine, is something where if you take it on a daily basis for not even a very long period of time, you can develop a dependence. And a dependence means that if you try to stop, it's going to become uncomfortable. You're going to go through withdrawal and all sorts of things. And the withdrawal can range from being like having a low-level flu to really being a devastatingly unpleasant experience, right? But when I realized that people were addicted not just to the opioid itself, but to all of the rituals and the lifestyle. You know, it's the reason why sometimes when a heroin addict can't get hold of the heroin, they'll actually put something else, whatever they can find, in a needle, and then, you know, wrap it around, do the arms, and go through the whole ritual of injecting the heroin, because that's what they're addicted to. Oftentimes, they were addicted to the lifestyle of being a heroin addict. It gave them a reason to get out of bed in the morning, because you had to get out of bed in the morning, and you had to figure out, where am I going to score? Now, wait a second, where am I first going to get the money so I can score? And by the way, I still got to look in on my mom sometime during this day, and maybe I got my kid I got to watch out, and maybe I got a part-time legal job too. You know, I got to worry about that. So it gave a kind of reason to keep going and moving. When heroin prescription programs started spreading around the world, Australia kind of blew it in being the first. Switzerland became the first beginning in the early 90s, and then the Dutch, and then the Danish, and then the Germans, and then the English came back with a little one, the Spanish little one, the Canadians came it. Now Norway has a little tiny program going. One fascinating thing about the heroin maintenance programs was that people's lives stabilized, their health improved, they actually reduced their use of most other drugs. You know, I mean, they were generally doing well if they were also provided with housing. I mean, they could get a part-time job, all this sort of thing. They weren't allowed to take the heroin home with them. They still had to go to a clinic and use it in the clinic, which not everybody wants to do, right? But it was stable. But you know the real problem they started finding? People were getting depressed. It was like now, for the first time, they could get their lady love pharmaceutical heroin for nothing, or for a few dollars, or pounds, or guilders, or francs, or whatever a day, and they were finding themselves getting depressed. Why? Because that being a junkie had been a life. It had given them something to get out of bed in the morning, and now it was kind of like, hey, come down to the clinic 2-3 times a day. Here's your drug, you got it. So it was a kind of, for me also, understanding that element of this thing, about what it means to be part of this lifestyle and why heroin maintenance makes sense. The other thing that was interesting about those heroin prescription experiments, I can't prove this, but I had the impression that in the European cities that introduced it, it took away some of the dynamism of the black market. Once you knew that once you're a heroin addict, and there was a certain camaraderie in being a heroin addict with other junkies, I mean, you're competing and fighting with one another, but there's a certain camaraderie and an identity, right? But that once it was, you had the option that, you know what? If you're getting tired of this life, of being a street heroin addict, and you can go and get yourself into a heroin maintenance program and stabilize your life. And it was like, there was something about that that I think took the excitement or the buzz out of being a street-level heroin addict, right? And what's notable, you know, when you do a heroin maintenance program in a big city, Zurich, London, you know, Copenhagen, whatever, you know, Amsterdam, you see some impact on the overall street markets because the numbers are not huge. But I remember being in Switzerland and going to a little town called Thun, T-H-U-N. I think there were maybe 100 heroin addicts in the city, and 50 of them landed getting up on the local program. And you actually saw the city change as a result of here was a population that had just been removed from this thing. So heroin, I began to realize that, yeah, cannabis we can legalize with relatively low level of risk. Psychedelics, tricky, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Opioids, you know, we're not necessarily thinking about making it anything available over the counter, although the libertarians would make a compelling argument that when you look comparatively, that in countries where you could in fact get opioids over the counter easily, that consumers were more likely to take precautions into their own hands. I also looked historically. When you looked at, say, late 19th century America, or UK, or Australia, or Canada, or a whole host of other countries, what you found was that, you know who the principal consumers of opioids were in those days? Middle-aged white women. consuming in a liquid form, laudanum or something else like that, right? Some of them becoming addicted to it. The famous playwright Eugene O'Neill's mother, and he wrote plays about it, right? So the addiction could be bad, but for many of them, it just became a sort of daily type of thing. You drank your laudanum every day. Right? And of course, nobody thought of criminalizing it back then because nobody wanted to think about putting their good white, auntie or grandma behind bars, right? So it was treated in a very medical way. What happened, I think, in your country, and certainly in my country and in Canada, was that once Chinese began migrating to the United States and working 80, 90 hours a week in the railroads and the mines and the factories, and then going back home and kicking back with the opium pipe the same way the white Americans were kicking back with their booze at night. But they were the Chinese, and they were, who knows what they were going to do in those opium dens and luring our precious white women into their opium dens. Well, that's when you got the first criminal prohibitions. And that's when the pressures began to apply, and that's when also the middle-aged white women began to be encouraged to get off of it and to move off of that sort of thing. But I began to realize that actually when it comes to dealing with a global heroin problem, an opioid problem, we actually have a lot of the solutions available. And that in a way, the way to think about it, if one thinks about how one deals with opioids and pain management, if you're in serious pain, and I'm here not talking about chronic pain where opioids can still be helpful for some people, but where you need to be careful. But I'm talking about more temporary acute pain. And you go to a doctor, and the doctor, you're complaining about the pain, and it's clear opioids will be helpful. And the doctor says to you, well, what opioid would you prefer? Would you prefer, I don't know the names in Australia, but Dilaudid or Demerol, or would you like morphine or diamorphine or codeine or whatever? And what's your response going to be? Doctor, I don't care. Give me the one which works the best. What do you mean by works the best? I mean the one that enables me to take away the pain without taking away my personality and ability to function, right? That doesn't put me out totally, right? And then the doctor says, okay, well, would you prefer it as an oral form or a gum or a patch or an injection or a patient-controlled analgesic device or a syringe? Doctor, I don't care. Give it to me in whatever form you think makes the most sense to accomplish my objectives, which is to take away my damn pain and at the same time to allow me to more or less function and be like a normal human being. And so optimally with pain management, you're going to look at not just opioids, but of course all the other non-drug and other drug forms in addition to opioids, but it's got a bottom line. Well, it always seemed to me that addiction treatment should be treated the same way. Like, what's going to work here? Okay, we know that oral methadone works the bestest for the mostest if you do it right, with a sensible, patient-centered approach. In America, we have a very hard time doing that. We only allow methadone to be prescribed through these isolated clinics, a little bit like we treat abortion, where the isolated clinics, and you have to go there specially. But I think in your country and others, you get it from the GP, you get it from the general doctor, from the pharmacist, whatever. And now we have something called buprenorphine, which maybe you have here as well, which is another form that also allows you to stabilize. But I remember being in England, and it turned out that 10% of the people getting methadone maintenance were getting it in an injectable form. I remember this doctor, Colin Brewer, talking about how he was amazed. Some guy drove up to the methadone clinic on a motorcycle, went inside, did his methadone injection, went outside, hopped back on his motorcycle, and drove right off. No problem, no accidents, what have you. And that seemed to work well for some people. Germany, for a long time, had everybody on codeine. When they still banned methadone, they had like tens of thousands of people on codeine maintenance. Right? In Iran, by the way, is the most fascinating country in the world when it comes to drug policy. I mean, they had opium maintenance for a long time. They've had the Alcoholics Anonymous in Iran. Normally, Alcoholics Anonymous in many countries has been anti-harm reduction. In Iran, it's the leading pro-harm reduction organization. It's the largest civil society organization allowed by the Islamic authorities. By the way, I did a podcast called Psychoactive, which I encourage you all to check out. It's on all the channels. But there's one about Iran called The Most Fascinating Country in the World on Drug Policy. But there, they were actually doing tincture of opium maintenance, right? So it means that that in dealing with the opioids, the key should be for people who want to stop living the life on the street and want to get their opioids in a legal form and lead a stable life and maybe get a job and maybe regain custody of their kids and maybe whatever it might be, that essentially, we need to treat it like we do a smart pain maintenance approach. Okay, so that's the opioids. And, in America, we ran into a dreadful thing with fentanyl, which fortunately has not hit most of the rest of the world. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid, it's typically given out in hospitals post-surgery. It's, many of us have been on fentanyl. I think even if you go for a colonoscopy, it's one of the medications they use. I mean, it's a fairly routine drug, highly potent though, right? 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin per milligram, right? So what happened in the United States 15 odd years, we went through a period in the late 90s. Well, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we had a major problem with the undertreatment of pain with opioids. And then there was a movement of which I was somewhat part to say, look, let's treat pain properly, and people need opioids. And we have, a problem called opiophobia, the irrational fear of opioids. Let's do this right. And then what happened was one of the major companies, Purdue Pharma, came up with a version of oxycodone that they called OxyContin, which turned out to be a miracle drug for people dealing with really bad pain. But then those fuckers at Purdue Pharma in the marketing department just started promoting it everywhere to people with chronic pain for whom it should not be used. And so the drug, all of a sudden we went from having just a heroin problem to having a heroin and pharmaceutical opioid problem. And then people responded and cracked down on that. And then what happened was people started having a harder time getting access to OxyContin, and they went back to heroin. At this point, the Mexicans, who have always provided at least a third of all the heroin consumed in the United States, started, shipping their heroin big time up to the United States, and we began to have a major heroin problem on top of the old pharmaceutical. Then there was a crackdown on that stuff, which didn't work all that well. More what happened was that the Mexican drug traffickers figured out that if you cut this stuff with fentanyl, you could cut the heroin fentanyl and make a lot more profit, because fentanyl was not that expensive. You could import it from China, at a fraction of the price. So you have some heroin, cut it with fentanyl. And initially, some of the heroin addicts were going, what the hell is this? But over time, they began to develop a taste for the fentanyl. Now in the United States, when you talk about opioid addicts on the street, if they get heroin, they go, what is this? Now the tastes have shifted to fentanyl. Fentanyl, however, with heroin, very few people die simply from taking too much heroin. Almost always a heroin overdose is actually mislabeled as a heroin overdose. In fact, it's more accurately labeled as a fatal drug combination. Almost everybody who died of a heroin overdose actually also had alcohol or benzodiazepines in their system. And as some of you may know, if you combine opioids with something with alcohol, or opioids with benzodiazepines, tranquilizer-type drugs, if you do it just right, it can be a really nice high. The problem is, if you mess up the dose just by half or double or whatever, it can stop your breathing. So it's one of these things with a really nice high. If you mess up the dose or if your tolerance is down, you can die. But it's normally a drug combination. Unusual to find somebody who died of a quote-unquote heroin overdose who was just heroin alone, right? With fentanyl, you don't need anything else. Fentanyl by itself will just kill you, will stop your breathing. And unfortunately, in the United States, what happened because of this over-promotion by not just one company, but almost all the big companies and distributors, meant that we started having people dropping dead like flies. And some of them were people coming from the street addict life, but some of them were people who were, had just gotten addicted to, pain pills, and they were dropping dead. You had people who would go out for a night and just buy a little cocaine, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of them were dead because somehow fentanyl had gotten into the cocaine supply for reasons that nobody could figure out. Right? So fentanyl, we started going from having 5,000 to 10,000 overdose fatalities in the late 90s to 20 to 40, to the point where we hit almost 100,000 people dying of an overdose, of which about 75% were fentanyl related by 4 or 5 years ago. Now those numbers have come down quite substantially, and we're not sure why. It may just be that the word got out there. It may just be that the number of people willing to take that risk of using something that could have fentanyl in it just finally dropped. It may well be that, during COVID, some of the harm reduction measures got more embedded in our healthcare system, so maybe that helped bring it down. There was also a little blip in it's almost always the case that trying to crack down on the supply of drugs coming from outside our country in Latin America has at best a very temporary impact, right? I mean, spending the tens of billions of dollars we spend trying to keep drugs out of the country has essentially all been money down the drain. If you really want to deal with it, you spend the money at home trying to keep people from getting in trouble with these drugs or helping them get out of trouble. The supply side is a hopeless way of dealing with it. So what happened, you know, with fentanyl, we really ran into it. And if somebody asked me the question, how come America got hit so bad by fentanyl, and Canada to some extent, which has, interestingly, a much more progressive drug policy? So one of the things that's hard for us harm reduction people is, like, why did British Columbia, which had a pretty ample harm reduction policy, more so than the US, also get hit with a really bad fentanyl overdose problem? And we don't have a really good answer for that. But it's interesting, why did most of Europe, I don't think Australia, this area, it just hasn't spread? There was some fear that, what's that? It did come. People keep thinking it's about to come. The Economist had an article saying, when is fentanyl coming to Europe? So it may be coming in, yeah. You're getting the nitazine. So the other thing is these other new synthetics coming in, the nitazines and other things that people are cutting fentanyl with or substituting it with, and that's a whole nother issue emerging, which I'll touch on briefly there. Now, it's interesting, though, I think in Europe, that they were so successful with their harm reduction policies beginning in the 80s into the early 90s, you know, because the Europeans had a major problem with street-related drug crime and overdose and all this stuff in the 80s and 90s, and they decided to turn their back after a few years on the American approach and embrace serious harm reduction approaches, which were not liberal. They were not tolerating open drug scenes on the streets. They were going to lock you up if you were being disorderly or what have you. I think one of the problems we did in the United States was that as the drug policy reforms, in which, you know, I and my organization played a leading role, more and more our reforms got embedded in a more kind of progressive set of ideals that involved tolerance for a kind of open drug scene culture, which was a devastatingly foolish thing for us to have done, because ultimately the public will accept harm reduction so long as it's not in their face. They will accept having people, you know, get the drugs they need or get clean needles. Just don't have it on the streets. Don't have me walking my kid in a baby stroller through the park and having to deal with an open drug scene. That is not acceptable, right? A lot of times when you see the reaction against harm reduction in the US right now, some of that is really less about the harm reduction policies per se than about the public display of illegal drug use that became most conspicuous during COVID, when most people were kind of off the streets and the cities are getting out of town, but the people who were struggling with mental illness or drug addiction were very, very even more visible because they represented a higher percentage of the people who are out on the streets. It is to say, though, I sometimes wonder, reflexively, if we could go back 20 years ago, when they had the crackdown on the pharmaceutical opioids, which got replaced by that heroin and then fentanyl, what would have happened if we had never cracked down hard on the pharmaceuticals? If we had cracked down somewhat, but if we had allowed a leaky, let's say a leaky pharmaceutical system to continue, now, you can't really plan public policy around a leaky, because it's considered bad, but in fact, imagine a leaky pharmaceutical system where, you know, doctors still, yeah, okay, easy prescribing, the way you would maybe not like quite with Valium, but something like that, or, you know, and not cracking down too much. I sometimes wonder whether or not, because given a choice between people getting their opioids from a leaky pharmaceutical system or getting it from illegally imported heroin or fentanyl, from a harm reduction approach and from a public order approach, you're much better off if they're getting from a leaky pharmaceutical system. At least the drugs are being produced legally, even if they're being, you know, gotten into the system illegally. I actually got this idea from reading William Burroughs' kind of famous book, Junkie, that he wrote in the 50s. And he talked about being a junkie in New York City in the late 40s and early 50s. And then there wasn't that much heroin around. People generally got it by going to a pharmacist or a doctor who was either, you know, naive or corrupt and doing it that way, or stealing from a pharmacy, you know, a pharmacy. And it was a much more benign situation back then. So there's an argument for a kind of leaky pharmaceutical system as being a way of accommodating the demand for illicit opioids and thereby undercutting the heroin market or the fentanyl market. Anyway, just throwing out that idea. Okay, now let's turn to second for the stimulants. I mean, we heard yesterday, you know, what's going on? I mean, cannabis use seems to be going down in Australia, in part because of the roadside drug testing and this horrible violation of what we would regard as civil liberties. But meanwhile, your wastewater, you guys are so weird. Wastewater in the system and the amphetamine and stimulants going up. And I think what's important to realize that is we know that the stimulants are more problematic. You know, nobody's figured out a way. As I say, you can be on opioids for a lifetime, taking daily use, and live a normal length life. But stimulants, if you're using too much of them, they wear your body out. Basically, what amphetamine does is when you take in amphetamine, it's taking an advance on tomorrow's energy reserves. And so that if you allow the body to rest the next day, you know, you'll be okay. You can take it again next week or in a few days like that. But if you're taking it every day, problematic. You know, by the way, that the U.S. Parts of the U.S. military, the air divisions of the U.S. military, allow, to this day, pilots, long-distance pilots, to take amphetamine or similar types of drugs, because it helps keep them awake. And you know, there's never been an accident, a U.S. military aviation accident involving the use of amphetamine. You know what the #1 cause of accidents is? Fatigue. It's fatigue. And what's the antidote for fatigue? Stimulants, amphetamine, right? So if it's being done where guys are flying 12 hours and then they rest for the next 48, 72 hours, that is a responsible approach to the use of amphetamine. Right? We know there's a guy who wrote a book not long ago about the Germans in World War II. And when they had their blitzkrieg, when they took Belgium and the Netherlands and then moved into France, right? One of the things they give such credit for that remarkable, you know, in, was it 3 or 6 weeks, you know, the German armies just swept through these countries and took them all over, right? And they say amphetamine played a pivotal role because you had these guys doing the amphetamine over. They could do it for a few weeks. They were awake, they were alert, they were mean, they were nasty, they were doing their thing. Right? And amphetamine actually helped them be a more effective fighting force. Conversely, when they then got involved on the Eastern Front and went into the Soviet Union and they got bogged down there for months and even years, amphetamine turned out to be a disaster because you just couldn't keep that up for that length of time, right? It's worth observing another point. Imagine you have in Australia the same issue we have in the U.S. with lots of young men who are being, or not young boys, and sometimes girls are being prescribed, I don't know what you call it, Alex, here, but Ritalin or, you know, the stimulant drugs to help them focus. And we know that for some young kids, it's a miracle drug. It helps them focus, make friends. We also know that it's oftentimes overly broadly prescribed to people who should not, kids who should not be taking it. But you understand that if you were to take that drug they're giving teenage boys and girls, and if you were then to change its formulation, but same drug, and smoke it or inject it, it would be indistinguishable from the methamphetamine that the junkies are getting fucked up on. And conversely, if you were to take that methamphetamine that the junkies are getting fucked on and just have it in a 5 milligram pill, it would be indistinguishable from more or less what the kids are taking. There'd be little different nuances of these things, but it means you're basically talking that the kids getting that drug in school and the junkies taking too much methamphetamine, their teeth falling out, all this sort of stuff, it's essentially the same drug being taken under different conditions in different forms. The other thing that's important to understand, I mean, I don't want anybody getting involved in getting addicted to stimulants or amphetamine, right? But, you know, you sometimes wonder when, you know, they say these things instantly addictive, da-da-da, just like they used to say about heroin, just like you said about marijuana decades ago, right? If anybody who gets into methamphetamine is going to land up, you know, looking like with their teeth falling out and body withered, all this sort of stuff. The question I wonder is, who's recruiting the new methamphetamine users? Like, oh, I want to look like that. I want to start using the drug that makes me look like that. And that's not happening. The people recruiting new methamphetamine users are people who are using methamphetamine or these drugs basically without falling to the harms. You know, there are oftentimes housewives or people like that who find like, oh, you know, I got this magic little pill and now I can do all the chores and be good with my kids and my husband's happy. And it can keep them going for 3, 6, 9 months, a year, what have you, right? Because they're taking it in that kind of oral form. But it is to understand that with every drug, the large majority of the people consuming them, in fact, are not landing up being, warmed over dead junkies. In point of fact, it is possible to take these substances in a particular form. Cocaine. All those indios, the Indians in Bolivia and Peru chewing their coca leaf, you chew the coca leaf, it reduces cocaine into your system. It's a slow drip form of letting cocaine into your system. About 30 years ago, the World Health Organization did a 19-country study where they looked at cocaine and they looked at coca. And their conclusions were twofold. That coca is probably a net benefit in terms of human consumption, notwithstanding the fact that it's a daily drip of cocaine into your body. And that the worst downside is that when you chew the coca leaf, you have to put a little bit of lime, not the fruit lime, but the other type of lime, in order to release it, and that can cause some harms in the cheek. Right? They also said that cocaine, the large majority of people using cocaine are not getting addicted to it. Now, that report was never formally released, and it was shelved under pressure from my government, but that was what a 19-country study found on this thing. So this is not to say that people won't really fuck themselves up with cocaine or amphetamine, and we know it, and we've seen it, and you may know people who do it, but it is to say that large numbers of people may well be taking these substances without anybody being aware of it, and without it being all that much of a problem. Sometimes the issue of the media coverage, right? That, I imagine an editor of a newspaper says to the journalist, okay, I want you to write me a story about alcohol in our local community here. And the journalist goes out and he goes to the detox, places. He goes to the 12-step meetings. He goes to the local jails where their drunks are. And he comes back with a story about how devastating alcohol is in the local community. And the editor goes, wait a second. And he opens up his side drawer, pulls out a bottle of whiskey, goes, you telling me that this is, what about, did you go to the places where people are drinking beer and having a good time? Did you go to the vineyards? Did you go to the wine tasting? Did you go to the place where people are getting good hard liquor, the micro distill? No, give me a comprehensive story about the totality of alcohol use that includes the AA meetings and the detox and the jails, but also includes the whole spectrum. Okay, same editor, same journalist. Write me a story about the use of methamphetamine in our community. And the journalist goes out and he goes to the same places, to the 12-step programs and the jails, et cetera. He comes back with this devastating portrait of methamphetamine. And the editor looks at the story and goes, this is great, fantastic, I'm running it. He doesn't bother to say, wait a second, aren't there any people using methamphetamine who are not addicted to it? I hear that academics do this thing called snowball research techniques. It's where you find somebody who might be a methamphetamine user who has not come in contact with any of the treatment or criminal justice systems, and then you ask them to introduce them to your friends, and then you snowball and snowball out from there to find more and more people out in the community who are using methamphetamine or some other stimulant, but not getting in trouble with it and not landing up in the jails or the 12-step programs. So we have this incredible distortion. Maybe someone heard me make the point yesterday about marijuana, that, why I was surprised to find out that when you ask people if they know people who use marijuana, if they say yes, that does not predict support for legalization. Because if you're not in the marijuana consuming world, the people you know who consume marijuana are not your friends, because either your friends don't smoke, or if they do, they don't tell you about it, right? And it's not that people getting straight A's and going to college, because if they're smoking, they're not talking about it. It's going to be your friend's fucked up kid who's dropping out of school and everybody knows he's a pothead, right? So it's the distortion in our perception of who in fact is a drug user. And it means we need to keep that in mind. I will tell you that when I would go and speak at the annual normal conferences, and people would be getting up and be saying, look, we got to legalize cannabis so that we can crack down harder on the methamphetamine heroin, and my response to them would be, shut the fuck up. Because no, you want to crack down harder on people committing robbery and theft and murder and rape? Sure, I'm with you. You want to crack down harder on people who are really inebriated, on the roads, or people who are, beating up their wives and kids under the influence of alcohol and other drugs? Sure, I'm with you. But the simple fact that somebody may be using heroin or amphetamine, whatever, no. Don't just beat on them just because they're using that drug. Hold people responsible for their actions. My core principle of drug policy. I begin with the core principle of sovereignty over our own minds and bodies. The core principle that nobody should be punished or discriminated against or amongst based solely upon what we put in our body, absent harm to others. That core principle of freedom. And that core principle needs to apply to every drug, from cannabis and psychedelics to heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, what have you. Do not punish me for what I put into my body if I am doing no harm to others. But with that have to be two other principles. The second principle is the one of responsibility. That whether I am a drug user or I am not, I need to be held responsible for my actions. Don't let me say, oh, the reason I mugged that little old lady for money was because I'm an addict and I needed to raise money in order to support my habit, or pay for my kids because I was spending my money. No. Freedom needs to become with responsibility. And the third principle is compassion. That people do really get caught up in addiction, and life is not equal and is not fair. And many of those who grew up with serious traumas in our lives as either prenatal or infants or baby or children or veterans or whatever it might be, that, people do get addicted because drugs help people keep going for a while until they start to turn on people. And that means that maybe somebody did commit a crime or knock somebody over the head, and it means that the judge needs to hold that person responsible, but at the same time take into account that this person's addiction means that maybe there might be a better approach for dealing with that addict to throwing them in jail. Yes, hold them responsible, but let's figure out what works best for that individual, for the people in their family, their community, and for the broader society, right? That key idea. The essence of harm reduction. It's about reducing the harms of drugs, but beneath that all is that core principle of not punishing people simply for what we put into our bodies absent harm to others. It's what I find so putrid about this drug testing, roadside drug testing thing you have here, because it's not about performance on the roads. It's not about making the roads safer. That the number of people that they're catching who are actually inebriated or high or under the influence is a tiny fraction of the people who are getting picked up. It's basically an ideologically driven purity test that violates the core principle of sovereignty of our own bodies, that the state has no business. It's also the point of discrimination. That God forbid you're a parent and you have two kids, one addicted to booze, one addicted to heroin or cocaine. There is no legitimate basis in modern ethics or in science or medicine or the Bible, for that matter, that says we're going to treat your alcohol-addicted kid one way and your heroin-addicted kid another way. What is the basis? From a medical perspective, the heroin addiction is less dangerous if they have a reliable supply than the alcohol one. What is the basis? The alcoholic kid, well, they're okay. They're not a criminal unless they get behind the wheel of a car and, get caught or whatever. The heroin addict, the cops can break down your goddamn door and arrest him simply for sitting in his bedroom taking that heroin and not even taking it, being in possession of it, right? There's a fundamental that violates principles of basic human rights, but also issues around equality and fairness that happens there. Okay, now, there is no easy answer on the stimulants, right? There isn't. I do sometimes think that what the world really needs is a good, safe stimulant. I do wonder, I've wondered sometimes, coffee's pretty damn good, tea's not bad, caffeinated sodas, they're all pretty good, but they can be a bit spiky in the way they work. I know, I got my doctor to prescribe me low-dose dextroamphetamine, 5 milligram dextroamphetamine. I did it for jet lag, and he does it. I take it for jet lag. I take it, occasionally if I need a little energy to do something in the evening. I've sometimes wondered, what if we were to do an experiment, and the experiment would take 50,000 people, 25,000 just rely on the legally available stimulants we have today. And the other 25,000, they get dextroamphetamine, and they can take it daily or periodically. And let's evaluate them 3 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 20 years, 20, 30 years, longitudinal up the gazoo studies, right? And look at them in terms of not just harm, but quality of life. How many of them landed up doing less well? How many of them landed up having higher quality lives, lower quality lives? I think there's a decent possibility that the 25,000 who had access to dextroamphetamine might land up averaging out with a higher quality of life in terms of functioning, enjoyment, whatever, than the group that did not. I can't prove that, but it is to say, some of this notion that we had about that human beings are best off being drug-free, underlying that core notion of drug-free being best, right, which it is for some people, but it assumes another underlying notion, which is that we all emerge from our mother's wombs as perfectly balanced chemical creatures. As perfectly balanced. But do we, in fact, all emerge from our mother's wombs as perfectly balanced chemical creatures? I mean, I know when I emerged, I was a very sweet, happy kid. When my brother emerged a year later, he was screaming from the day he emerged from the womb, and he hasn't stopped ever since then. He's just wired differently, right? There are kids, you can look at them, they look like they're going to be an addict 10 years from now. You just look at the way they respond to stimuli. We know there's now this research, Gabor Mate did his most recent book looking at, trauma prenatal, or immediately after being born. We know that there are things that change our wiring. We know that we all have our own natural endorphin systems, our own natural opioid receptor systems. We now know we have our own natural endocannabinoid systems. We know that there are other sites of receptor systems. We also know that every system is not equal. We know that sometimes these systems may be harmed or altered. We know, for example, that when people start taking heroin, some people, oh my God, it's the best thing in the world. It's better than orgasm. Other people, ugh, I threw up. I never want to touch that stuff again, right? We know people respond differently to these substances. We know that if you get into heroin, it may undermine your body's natural production of its own natural opioids. All of these things vary. We know that ultimately when it comes to whether it's pain management or addiction treatment or stimulants or opioids, that we're all wired differently. That in some respects, the challenge we face in coming to, I've always said, the challenge is not how do we build a drug-free society. The challenge is not how do we build a bigger moat between the drugs and our kids or the drugs and ourselves, right? The challenge is to accept the reality that there's never been a drug-free society, and there probably never will be a drug-free society. And then the question is, how do we learn how to live with drugs so they cause the least possible harm, and in many cases, the greatest possible benefit? It means that to some good extent, what we're trying to do is to kind of negotiate the space as individuals between the chemicals that are external to our body and the chemicals that are internal to our body. How do we find that right balance between the chemicals out there, the plants and synthetic things, and not the plants, but the substances, the psychoactive substances that are inside here? And similarly, as a society, how do we manage those things through laws and regulations between the substances that are out there and the ones that are in here? That, to some extent, is the bigger challenge, which now leads me, and I'll wind up with this, the psychedelics. God bless the psychedelics. And MDMA, which is not really a psychedelic. But I'm sure many of you have experience with these substances. I mean, MDMA, which was rediscovered by Sasha Shulgin about 40, 50 years ago and became known initially as a couples therapy drug. And we know it's a beautiful drug in terms of what's called an empathogen. We also know, you don't want to take too much of it. You don't want to be doing it all the time. There could be problems. We're not exactly sure what very frequent use at high levels over a long period of time it does. But we do know that when you look at the cost, the benefit risk ratio, that with cannabis and psychedelics, the net benefit for most individuals and society significantly exceeds the downsides, right? Now we have this extraordinary psychedelic renaissance. And I stopped running Drug Policy Alliance in 2017. We didn't do much on psychedelics because there wasn't much to be done then. In the courts or in the legislatures or ballot initiatives, public opinion wasn't ready for it. But this explosion, where, going to the conference, the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver 3 years ago that MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, sponsored, 12,000 people. The extraordinary bipartisanship with leading Republicans, oftentimes taking the lead even more than the Democrats on making access available to veterans and then saying, well, if it works for veterans, maybe it's going to work for other people as well. Former Governor Rick Perry of Texas, who tried to run for president and then became part of President Trump's cabinet in his first term, now saying he wants that they're trying to make Ibogaine legally available for veterans and others is going to be the #1 mission for the rest of his life. One of the most putrid politicians in modern American history, Newt Gingrich, the key Republican in our Congress in the 90s, right? I mean, this is a guy who's saying, oh my God, we can save millions of lives with Ibogaine, right? You have people, military veterans in the special forces, people who risked their lives, saw their friends killed, traumatized by that, who are saying this stuff is a miracle substance for me. And it's not just a drug, obviously. It's the way it's administered. It's the helping care that comes with it. It's the integration that comes afterward. It's the fellowship that sometimes comes out of it, not unlike sometimes 12-step programs. But what's happening in this world is this true renaissance. And some of it is understanding the wisdom that indigenous people have been connected to for a very long time, and that does need to be honored. At the same time, it's people wanting to make a shitload of money and having, companies like Compass and Atai, worth billions of dollars that are trying to develop new psychedelic versions of old psychedelic substances that they can patent and make a lot of money on because they've been proven in controlled studies to be legitimate. But at the same time, there's good old mushrooms, which you can find in the woods or which you can grow with a little kit in your home. And that's why I'm very proud of the fact that, in Oregon, we did not medicalize psychedelics. When Oregon passed that ballot initiative legalizing psilocybin therapy, and now 10 to 15,000 people have been through these programs. It's still expensive, right? But it's done in a health and wellness context. And then when Colorado followed that up by saying we are going to not only approve that with a broader variety of substances, but we're also going to allow people to grow their own, right? And some people on the left were going, no, we want to be able to grow 1,000 pounds of mushrooms, and that's what our freedom's about, and get the goddamn corporate forces out of that and the fuck you scientists. And my view is chill the fuck out, because the scientists are coming up with stuff that's really going to help people. And the corporate players trying to make a gazillion dollars, some of that stuff's really going to help people as well. But meanwhile, it's not going to get in the way of us growing our own mushrooms or finding them in the fields or having a San Pedro plant which produces mescaline, the same thing as peyote, right? Letting 1,000 flowers bloom and focusing on harm reduction and safety, making sure that if stuff is being sold over the counter, it's being sold safely, making sure that young people and old know don't use it and go to a big concert, don't hang out with people you don't know, basic harm reduction approaches. I think that's got to be the future. Ultimately, the ultimate objective, if you imagine a spectrum of drug policy going from the most highly punitive to the most highly free market, it's to be moving down this spectrum, reducing as much as possible the harms of prohibitionist and harsh regulatory policies, while at the same time minimizing the harms and maximizing the potential benefits of these substances. It's moving down this spectrum as best we can, keeping in mind the basic values of science, compassion, health, and human rights. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. That was food for thought, as the saying goes, but beyond that, well beyond that. We are out of time in terms of any questions, unfortunately. Ethan's around for a little bit of time. Maybe you're going to be in the rally and the march. Of course you are. The main point of MardiGrass is the rally and the march. That's going to happen at 2 o'clock. So grab Ethan. I'm sure you'll be happy to have a
I'll stay around,
conversation
happy
with
to
you.
answer any questions, and I'll be around for the day.
If you've got a question for him, he'll have an answer. I can guarantee that much. Force of nature.
Yeah.
And
have a listen to the podcast. Psychoactive, it's called. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah.
What's the podcast? Which one?
Psychoactive.
Psychoactive.
There's 80 episodes on the whole spectrum of drugs, leading thinkers and people from around the world.
Ethan Nadelmann, Google him. You'll find all sorts of videos and TED Talks and all sorts of stuff, all completely informative. Thank you once again, Ethan. Another round of applause, at least 2 rounds of applause for Justified in the Circumstances. Thank you.